Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Food for Thought. My name is Alex Colvin, and I am the Exhibits, Publications, and Programs Coordinator here at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. I'd like to thank you for joining us for this virtual program. As most of you know, the building is closed today for the state and federal holiday of Juneteenth. But next month, we will return to an in-person and online meeting for our next Food for Thought lecture on Thursday, July 17th, as Scott Duncan presents Southern Rivers, Restoring America's Freshwater Diversity. I would like to thank the Alabama Humanities Alliance for making 2025 Food for Thought possible through a grant, and the Friends of the Alabama Archives for sponsoring these events. Now on to today's program. I am so excited to welcome Dr. Isabela Morales, who is a historian and the author of Happy Dreams of Liberty, An American Family in Slavery and Freedom. The book has received numerous honors, including the Frederick Douglass Book Prize, the leading International Book Award for Scholarship on Slavery and Emancipation, and the Tom Watson Brown Book Award, a prestigious recognition on Civil War history. And today she's going to be talking about that book, and it is available on our online store, and I'll drop the link for you in the chat. But please join me in welcoming Dr. Morales.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Alex, for the introduction. I am coming to all of you now from New Jersey, but I'm actually an alumna of the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa, so it is really wonderful to be with you virtually in Alabama again. I am especially honored to have the speaker slot today on Juneteenth as we as individuals and as a nation reflect on what promises of freedom have and have not yet been fulfilled over the last 160 years. That's really the focus of my book, taking the story of one family, the Townsends, following them in their journey from slavery to freedom and exploring how or whether they were able to exercise that freedom, their rights as free people, in post-Civil War America. So who were the Townsends? Well, they're not a family you are likely to find in history textbooks. The Townsends I wrote about were the enslaved children of two white cotton planter brothers, Samuel and Edmund Townsend, and 7 enslaved women whom they owned on their vast Alabama plantations in the decades before the Civil War. As you may know, slavery in the United States followed the condition of the mother. That meant that no matter who your father was, black or white, enslaved or free, a poor farmer or a rich plantation owner, or the president of the United States in some famous cases, if your mother was enslaved, you were born into slavery too, which meant that the Townsends weren't just Samuel and Edmund's children. They were legally their property. That's not actually what made the Townsends unusual, however. Enslaved women in the antebellum South were incredibly vulnerable to rape and abuse from white men like the Townsend brothers, who held such immense power over their lives. What was unusual about the Townsend family was how Samuel and Edmund viewed the children of these women whom they had abused. As one neighbor recalled a conversation with Samuel, he spoke kindly and tenderly of his children and said that they never should serve anybody after he died. Now, neither brother ever married, so they had no wives or legitimate children to carry on their family legacy. These enslaved children were the only heirs they would ever have. And in their minds, that's what they were, their rightful heirs, despite their legal status as slaves. And we can see this in the way that these two brothers wrote about their children in their wills. In his will, Samuel Townsend used the word slave to describe most of the nearly 200 men and women whom he owned. But he never used that word for his or his brother's children. Instead, they called him his servants or favorites. He called them the favorite objects of my bounty in one passage in the will. And he specifically wrote in that will that he wanted his children treated just as if they were, quote, white children. He wanted to legitimize them in the eyes of the law. We also know that Edmund, the elder brother, had similar views. Based on how he talked about his daughters, the sheriff of Madison County himself was under the impression that those two girls were already free and not enslaved. When Edmund died in 1853, he attempted to leave his 2 sons and 2 daughters, all of them enslaved, almost the entirety of his $500,000 fortune. Now, in 2025 money, that $500,000 estate would be worth more like $17 million. This was the largest bequest from a slave owner to enslaved people in Alabama history. And Edmund had been so wealthy and powerful during his life, and importantly, had such a reputation for violence when challenged, that no one had ever dared to challenge him before. So he probably didn't expect that anyone would contest his wishes after he died. Now, he was wrong about that. A white man having enslaved children didn't fundamentally upset the rules of white supremacy, because those children and the mothers of the children remained enslaved. As long as the wealth and power was firmly in the hands of the white slave owners, mixed race children like the Townsends could essentially be overlooked. And in Madison County, where they were enslaved, they were. Allowing these children to join the ranks of the elite, however, granting them freedom and hundreds of thousands of dollars, now that crossed a line. So in 1853, Edmund's white relatives challenged his will in court, and they won. His children were not emancipated, and they did not receive their $500,000 inheritance. Now, Samuel, the younger brother, watched all of this happen. Like Edmund, Samuel considered his enslaved children to be his heirs. And as long as he was alive, Madison County's white community indulged his behavior. But if his children's privileged status was going to last beyond his lifetime, Samuel needed to guarantee that his will didn't meet the same fate as Edmund's. So he brought in reinforcements. He hired this man, Septimus Douglas Cabanis, a successful Huntsville attorney, to make his will airtight against the inevitable lawsuits and legal challenges that he knew his white relatives would bring against it once he died. Samuel was very anxious about what would happen to his children after his death. On one occasion, he told Cabanis, quote, "I have witnessed that nothing can be done here under the law for a slave." And he was right to be worried. In mid-19th century Alabama, emancipating enslaved people was extremely difficult, and that was by design. White Alabama residents didn't want a large free Black population in the state. They thought that would lead to slave rebellions and political upheaval. But Cabanis, the lawyer, was very good at his job. And I'd be happy to get into this in detail when we have time for questions. But long story short, when Samuel died in 1856 and the lawsuits over his will started coming, Cabanis was able to fight them off. It took 4 years, but in 1860, Samuel Townsend's children and Edmund's daughters were finally freed and began to inherit some of their father's fortune. Their names were Wesley, Caroline, Willis, Thomas, Charles Osborne, Parthenia, Milka, Joseph Bradford, Susanna, Elizabeth, and Virginia Townsend. And at that time, the youngest of them, Susanna, was 7 years old, and the eldest, Wesley, was 29 years old. These 11 individuals, along with a 12th woman named Elvira Townsend, were granted equal shares in a trust fund worth $200,000, the equivalent of $6 or $7 million in today's currency. Samuel's will also freed the surviving mothers of his children, as well as those women's children by enslaved partners, for a total of 45 individuals freed in his will. And that's just the start of the story. At that time, the laws of Alabama prohibited formerly enslaved people from remaining in the state after being freed. So in the years and decades that followed their emancipation, members of the Townsend family would migrate all across the country, attending Wilberforce University in Ohio, homesteading and fighting for civil rights in Kansas, mining for silver in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, and in the case of one son, even returning to Hazel Green, Alabama, to purchase a piece of Samuel Townsend's old plantation where he and his family had once been enslaved. In all of these places, the Townsends were seeking communities where they could build new lives as free people on a basis of equality with their neighbors, where they could pursue social and economic mobility using their dual legacies of money and mixed race ancestry to shape their own identities and futures. They were pursuing the American dream. But as you might imagine, for a family like the Townsends, it wasn't easy. The title of my book, Happy Dreams of Liberty, comes from a letter by a man named David Lakin, who was hired in 1860 to take members of the Townsend family safely out of Alabama and find homes for them in the free states. Now, Lakin was a white Southerner, and he was not sympathetic to the Townsends. Frankly, he didn't think they should ever have been freed. Writing to the lawyer Cabanis, who was at that time now the executor of the Townsend estate, Lakin said, quote, "They have happy dreams of liberty. But if they could realize how much more happy they would be back on an Alabama plantation, they would certainly be sad enough." Now you can imagine what the Townsends thought about that. But in Lakin's mind, in Cabanis's mind, and in the minds of many white people the Townsends would encounter in their lives, their hopes for a better life in freedom were contemptuous, an illusion. Yet their journey across the United States, as well as from slavery to freedom, took place during one of the most radically transformative periods in American history. The Civil War ended slavery throughout the nation. African Americans won their freedom and citizenship. Black men won the right to vote and hold office. In fact, Thomas Townsend, one of Samuel's sons, would actually be elected one of Huntsville's first two African American city aldermen in 1880. So this was a time of immense change and possibility. And the Townsends' emancipation and inheritance the year before the Civil War broke out gave them access to freedom and property, hallmarks of whiteness in a society where Blackness was associated with inferiority and enslavement. Now, it's important to note that the Townsends did have advantages in their pursuit of social and economic mobility that the vast majority of freed people did not coming out of the Civil War. And I describe these advantages in the book as race, place, and money. And I'll start with money. The Townsends' inheritance from their father Samuel had a concrete effect on their experience of freedom. White communities across the free states often met African American migrants like the Townsend family with violence and animosity. But some made exceptions for the Townsends because they brought desirable capital that those communities weren't going to turn away. As one neighbor in Ohio observed, quote, "I have yet to see the first man that refuses to sell a colored man anything they have for sale if the colored man can pay for it." And the Townsends could usually pay for it. Though I'll add that they never did receive the full inheritance they were owed. The Townsends had been promised equal shares in a trust fund worth $200,000. But by the time the estate was finally settled, and that's not until 1890, 30 years after their emancipation, they had received less than a third of what they were owed, around $4,000 or $5,000 each for the surviving Townsends. This was still a fortune compared to the finances of the vast majority of freed people after the Civil War, who came out of slavery with nothing but the clothes on their back. But it was, nevertheless, a disappointment to the Townsends, and they had their suspicions. As executor, Cabanis received a salary of $3,000 per year. To the Townsends, that seemed like a very strong incentive to drag out the process of settling the estate for as long as possible. Samuel's eldest son, Wesley, hinted at this in an 1866 letter to Cabanis. He said, "We are told by a great many that you will never settle the state of Samuel Townsend with us as long as you live." His brother Willis was even more blunt when he wrote, quote, "It is hardly worthwhile to ask you to send any money, because if you was to do it, you would do something you never did yet." Wesley and Willis and other family members believed that Cabanis was cheating them out of their inheritance. The reality was the estate simply wasn't worth $200,000 anymore. Samuel Townsend's will was probated and inventoried in 1860. Civil War broke out in 1861. And at that time, Cabinus, the lawyer, had not yet finished liquidating Samuel's property. And also a fair bit of what he had sold had been purchased on credit. Now, Cabinus was at least prudent enough not to take payments in Confederate money during the war, but still by 1865, the Townsend estate had been considerably devalued. And there's a tragic irony here. Cabinus told Wesley before the war, when he was selling parts of Samuel's property, that the land sold low, but the Negroes sold high. This meant that most of the money owed to the Townsend estate, to Samuel and Edmund's children as their inheritance, came from the sale of enslaved people that they had known and lived alongside in Alabama. Now, after the war, many of the estate's debtors were bankrupt, and some of those who weren't simply refused to pay on the grounds that the slaves they had purchased had been taken from them by the federal government. So ironically, emancipation was actually the cause of some of the Townsend's financial difficulties. Yet the Townsend's inheritance, or at least the portion of it that they did receive, enabled them to receive a formal education, to purchase homes, and to start building generational wealth that they could hand down to their children, just as Samuel had left his wealth to them. But Samuel and Edmund had given their children another powerful bequest, and that was their mixed race ancestry. Then, as now, racial prejudice damaged people's lives, while whiteness endowed privileges and advantages. And members of the Townsend family experienced both of these effects. White associates, acquaintances, and others they encountered over the course of their lives interacted differently with members of the Townsend family, depending on their parentage and perceptions of their physical appearance. One Freedmen's Bureau agent, after meeting Samuel's daughter Milka, wrote in a letter, "The woman is nearly white," and that he would never have known she was African American if he hadn't also met her husband, who had visibly darker skin. As another example, Elizabeth, or Lizzie, one of Edmund's daughters, married a white Civil War veteran after the war and moved away from the family to North Carolina. After that, in censuses and other historical records, she was listed as white. She had passed into white society. Her neighbors and community, maybe even her husband, might not have known that she was once enslaved. She was and always had been a free white woman as far as they were concerned. But that wasn't the only path for mixed race people at this time. And Elizabeth was actually the only member of the Townsend family who did take that path. Now, why was this? Well, in the half century between the end of slavery and the rise of Jim Crow, racial categories and hierarchies in the United States were remarkably fluid, more fluid than we might imagine today. Historian Martha Hodes coined the phrase shading towards whiteness as opposed to passing for white. And so that's something that I found influential while working on this book. Hodes wrote in her book, The Sea Captain's Wife, that the 19th century Caribbean was a place of more flexible racial categories, where factors like education, property ownership, and wealth could all combine to move a mixed race person closer to the social status of whiteness and all of the privileges that came along with it, even if their neighbors knew that they had once been enslaved or had African ancestry. In my research, I found that the United States after the Civil War was also a place where moneyed mixed race people like the Townsends could shade towards whiteness. Geography, like money and mixed race ancestry, played a key role here, and Samuel's son Charles Osborne Townsend is a great example. After serving as a Union Army clerk and later quartermaster in Vicksburg during the Civil War, Charles Osborne migrated to Colorado Territory in the late 1860s along with several relatives, going into business as a barber and also hoping to strike it rich silver mining in the Rocky Mountain boomtown of Georgetown, Colorado. Now, Charles Osborne unfortunately never did hit the silver bonanza he was looking for, But he did experience an exceptional level of social and political equality in his small community. Georgetown was a place where Black and white settlers played on the same baseball teams, attended each other's weddings, and formed business partnerships. And the reason for this was demographic. In Colorado, white settlers saw the Chinese migrant laborers and Native Americans, such as the Ute people who were the original inhabitants of the region, as the outsiders, not African American settlers who were largely Christians, farmers, and miners who shared their culture and customs. In this specific place and time, white Colorado residents saw African Americans like the Townsends as part of the in-group, not as others, which gave Charles Osborne and his relatives opportunities there that were not shared by family members elsewhere in the country. But I found that racial hierarchies could also be surprisingly flexible, even in places you might not expect, like post-war and even post-Reconstruction Alabama. Thomas Townsend, another of Samuel's sons, spent the Civil War as a school teacher in Kansas. But in 1868, he returned to Madison County, Alabama, where he had been born and enslaved, and started buying land. First, he bought a small 50-acre farm, then a home in Huntsville proper. And in 1871, he even purchased a piece of one of his father Samuel's old plantations. He was a teacher and a landowner, essentially a natural leader during Reconstruction. But his political career as a city alderman didn't begin until 1880, 3 years after federal troops left the former Confederate states, and 6 years after white Southerners reclaimed control of Alabama's state government. Reconstruction in Alabama was effectively over by that point, but Thomas was still able to build a political career by maintaining close, relatively friendly ties with Huntsville's white leadership. His mixed-race ancestry, his middle-class respectability, his education and wealth, essentially his ability to shade towards whiteness, all protected him at a time when African Americans across the country faced increasing violence and repression. Now, of course, the rise of Jim Crow across the South changed this dynamic. With the establishment of the one-drop rule, it didn't matter how light your skin was or how much money you had in the bank. One drop of African ancestry made you a second-class citizen. You're either Black or white, which meant that changing attitudes about race were shrinking that in-between space that the Townsends once occupied and used to carve out spaces of autonomy for themselves, to shape their own identities. Which is why by the 1890s and early 1900s, you get someone like William Bolden Townsend, Samuel Townsend's eldest grandson, who became a lawyer in Kansas and a very outspoken civil rights activist. William Bolden recognized that the qualities his father's generation had relied on to advance themselves, namely money and mixed-race ancestry, would no longer protect African Americans. In a speech in 1905, he said, quote, "Now and then one of us might be able to overcome the storm of oppression and fight his or her way to the stars, but he or she is an exception to the rule." The American dream was no longer for people like the Townsends. In this book, I wanted to follow the Townsends in their lives and travels, to reconstruct their experiences of slavery in Alabama, of their first years of freedom in Ohio, Kansas, and Colorado, and of their successes and struggles over the course of half a century. And in doing so, I tried to render family members' experiences and personalities vividly, but also compassionately, and often using their own words. I was aided in that by the source materials that I had access to, specifically an archival collection at the University of Alabama called the Septimus D. Cabaniss Papers. These are the legal documents of the Huntsville attorney Cabaniss, who served as the executor of Samuel Townsend's estate after he died. And fortunately for historians like me, he saved everything. There are 15,000 items total in that collection. I first encountered these papers in 2010 as an undergraduate at the University of Alabama. My junior year, I took my first research seminar on American slavery. And the idea with that class was by the end of the semester, each student was expected to produce a paper based on archival research in the university's special collections library. Now, I had never set foot in an archive before, let alone handled or interpreted 150, 200-year-old letters, wills, and inventories, nor did I have any idea how I was supposed to find an original research topic. So one night, I just started scrolling through the library's online finding aids, and lucky for me, I found the Cabinets papers. I read the brief description of this lawyer's career and his involvement with Samuel Townsend, a slave owner who left his fortune to 45 enslaved people, and I thought, I can write 20 pages on that. So I did, and then I kept writing about it for more than a decade now, which brings me here. And as proof, this is me giving my first presentation on the Townsends in 2012. Obviously, I have been writing and talking about this family for a long time now, and that's because of the richness of the collection. First of all, there are the letters. The Cabinets papers include 2 boxes of letters written by the formerly enslaved Townsends themselves. That's around 170 first-person narratives in their own words. It's a goldmine for historians of slavery. But even these sources are not perfect windows into the Townsends' innermost thoughts and experiences, right? The vast majority of the letters were written by members of the Townsend family to the lawyer Cabinets, which means they were carefully crafted documents created for a specific purpose. And that was usually to get Cabinets to send the money out of their father's estate. In writing these letters, the Townsends took what they knew about their audience, Cabinets, a white Southerner, a former slave owner himself, and presented themselves accordingly. This means that the Townsends' letters need to be read as closely for what they hide as for what they reveal. And we can get a sense of just how much they hide by comparing the letters to Cabinets with the letters written between members of the Townsend family to each other, not to the lawyer. There are only about a dozen of these in the collection, and they're mostly from Charles Osborne in Colorado to his brother Thomas in Alabama. Charles Osborne's letters are full of details about his personal life and political opinions, and they're the only letters in the collection where the Townsends reminisce about their family's past. In one letter, Charles tells his brother, quote, Wade and Austin, and these are relatives of his, Wade and Austin and I sit around Sundays and talk over things that happened 25 years ago in the South. Letters like this one are artifacts of private thoughts and conversations that would otherwise be lost to time. And I can only wish I had an entire collection of letters like this. Of course, I don't. And there are other problems with these papers for interpreting the story as well. One of them is the gender bias in the collection. Most of the letters were written by Samuel's son. The eldest son, Wesley, wrote 38 existing letters. The most prolific writer of the daughters, Susanna, wrote 9. This means telling the Townsend women's story is a more complicated task than telling the men's. For that, I needed to take other sources that on the surface don't necessarily look as promising, wills, inventories, legal documents, and read them against the grain, as historians like to say. I'll give one example. In 1858, the lawyer Cabinets made a very detailed inventory and appraisal of all of Samuel Townsend's property. That means land, livestock, farm equipment, and the enslaved people that he owned as human property. This inventory gave their names and ages, injuries they had, as well as what the lawyer estimated their monetary value might be on the auction block. So I could see from this document that Hannah, the mother of Thomas Townsend, had, quote, a crippled hand. The fact that she had given Samuel Townsend a son hadn't saved her from hard labor cultivating and processing cotton. I could also see that Hannah had children with an enslaved man named Dick, both before and after Thomas was born. meaning that Samuel Townsend had thought nothing of separating her from her chosen partner, a man even he described as her husband, to satisfy his own desires. Now, there's another line on the inventory that I find particularly interesting. Rainey, the mother of Samuel's eldest son, Wesley, and daughter, Caroline, gave birth to another child in 1853. Now, this was not one of Samuel's children, but fathered by an enslaved man. 1853 was also the year that Samuel started writing the will that would ultimately liberate Rainey and her children, and she named that child Freeman. I look at that and think maybe this is a glimpse into Rainey's thoughts, that she knew about Samuel's will in 1853 and dreamed of freedom for her infant child. My hope with writing this book is that stories and insights like these add to the body of work about enslaved people's lived experiences and to our understanding of the diversity and complexity of their lives. Now, I should add that I am not the first historian to look at these documents or to write about the Townsend family. The first was Francis Cavaness Roberts, a prominent Alabama historian and a major figure in the founding of the University of Alabama Huntsville campus. Dr. Roberts was the lawyer Septimus Cavanass's great-granddaughter, and she donated his papers to the University of Alabama in the 1950s after she used them to write her master's thesis on the Townsend family in 1940. And while I am deeply indebted to her for donating the Cavanass papers to an institution where historians like me can access them, I do have some issues with Dr. Roberts' story of the Townsend family. For decades, her thesis, titled An Experiment in the Emancipation of Slaves by an Alabama Planter, was the first and last word on the Townsends, with Dr. Roberts framing their lives as a test of African Americans' ability to sink or swim without the guidance of a benevolent master. And in her view, the experiment failed. She told a story of former slaves who mismanaged their inheritance, leading to poverty and hardship, of a family too stubborn to accept the well-meaning advice of their very long-suffering lawyer, her great-grandfather. In the end, Dr. Roberts essentially agreed with David Lakin when she concluded that the Townsends would have been happier in slavery, where, she wrote, they would have at least been well cared for and protected from the time they were born until they died. Now, obviously, this thesis was very much a product of the time when it was written. Early 20th century scholarship denied the violence and inhumanity of slavery. It asserted the innate inferiority of African Americans and ultimately served to justify the racial segregation of the Jim Crow era. This is what she learned in college and taught as a professor. But that's not how historians think about slavery today. So when I look at the Cavanass papers and read the Townsend's letters, I see a very different story about an egotistical master whose affection for his children didn't prevent him from violence and cruelty toward other enslaved people, about a powerful lawyer who struggled to see his clients' mixed-race children as fully capable of exercising their freedom or inheritance, about freed people seeking autonomy for themselves in ways both large and small. To me, it's the story of men and women whose money, mixed race ancestry, and geographic dispersal opened doors to economic and social mobility in a hostile society, and the times and places where prejudice closed those doors and frustrated their choices. And I am aware that in some ways this is a small story. The Townsends were not major actors in the affairs of the nation. Their family background as the emancipated children of their enslaver was complicated, but it wasn't unique. These were ordinary people pursuing the same American dreams that we still struggle for today: education, good jobs, home ownership, financial security. Sometimes they succeeded, and other times they met resistance in a society that considered their attempts offensive or contemptible. But even small stories about ordinary people, can have a powerful impact. They give us insights into the complexity of history and the diversity of real people's experiences that can otherwise get lost in broader narratives. They help us understand where our communities and where we as individuals fit into those larger narratives of American history. And they challenge what we think we know about how people lived in the past. And that all seems pretty big to me. A couple years ago, I was fortunate enough to be invited to a family reunion of Townsend descendants. Now, the family traces their ancestry back to Caroline Townsend Stone, the daughter of Samuel Townsend and an enslaved woman named Rainey. And as soon as I arrived, I could tell how excited everyone was to meet me. One of the kids, who seemed very young to be reading my book, asked shyly if I would sign his copy. They basically acted like I was a celebrity. And I have seen the sales numbers for my book. This is not a bestseller by any means, but it was immediately clear how important this research was to this family. They told me that my undergraduate papers, which had ended up on the University of Alabama Library's website, had provided the first historical details anyone in the family had ever seen about Caroline's life in slavery. These papers were also the first places where they'd ever read the names of Caroline's parents, Samuel and Rainey. One man told me that he liked that the book gave him details about the richness of enslaved people's lives that he didn't often see in popular media. He said, they weren't just slaves, they were people. And comments like that proved to me how meaningful and relevant this kind of history, family history, local history, can be in the present day. Because that was my hope for this book, to illustrate the humanity of a family whose human dignity and rights were often questioned and denied in their lifetime. We are living at a historical moment when stories about people like the Townsends are being wiped from websites, they're being pulled from library books, removed from school curricula. And history is what shapes us. It's what shapes our communities and the institutions that structure our society. We know it's not always pretty. But when we suppress or ignore the difficult stories, or when we refuse to hear the voices of people like the Townsends, we are not just doing an injustice to their memories, we are doing a disservice to ourselves. Which is why I am honored to be able to share some of that untold and increasingly embattled history here today and in my book. And I very much look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Morales. That was an amazing presentation that really can show you, like you said, the importance of one family and how the ripple effects can go out from there. And I really appreciated being able to hear more about it. If anyone has a question, feel free to put it in the comments. I'll be able to see it and share it. But in the meantime, I had so many questions, and organizing my thoughts, one of the ones that kind of came to me as you talked about, you found this research when you were doing a project, and it was going to be, a smaller project looking at that, and you just kept going. Can I ask, was there a particular letter or a moment or something? What convinced you that this needed to be a bigger project?
Right. So the photo I shared a little earlier in the slide of me in 2012 giving a presentation, it was a presentation on the paper I wrote, which was specifically about Susanna Townsend. My honors thesis at UA was about Susanna's life and those 9 letters that she wrote. And that's really the only documentation we have of her in the historical record is her name being listed on the inventory and these 9 short letters in her own words. And despite the scarcity of the information about her, I found her so fascinating that I wrote, an entire 20, 30 pages on her life. She was the youngest Townsend emancipated in 1860. She was 7 years old. She got an education at Wilberforce University before the school closed during the Civil War. So she had, about 1.5, 2 years at school before war broke out. And she was an orphan. Her mother was dead, and her older brother was very ill and really couldn't look after her. And so she kind of gets shunted off onto Wesley, the eldest brother, who's so much older than her that she calls him Uncle Wesley. He's, her half brother. She calls him her uncle, and she's living in his house, basically functioning as a servant. She is doing hard labor helping to support the family, especially during the war when Wesley gets drafted. And, it's just her and Wesley's wife trying to support his family. Wesley has lots of young children. And she has to grow up really fast. And even though by the end of the war, she's just a young teenager, she really sees herself as being an adult and having borne adult responsibilities and therefore being worthy of exercising autonomy. And she very sadly, tragically passes away at the age of 16 from tuberculosis. But in, the 3 years between the end of the Civil War and her death at age 16, she sends these letters to the lawyer Cabaniss in which you get such a strong sense of her personality, that she stands up for Wesley, that she insists on taking care of her own money. There was one letter, she was 13 years old, and she says to Cabaniss, I'm big enough not to get cheated out of my money. I'm an adult, and she's 13. And she was really just such an incredible, strong personality. And it came out so vividly and forcefully that I had to write about her. And, when I went deeper into the other letters and the other documents, I was able to find those personalities in other members of the Townsend family as well. Because, I'm interested in writing about people. I don't want to use people as kind of a vector for historical argument. I want to talk about them and write about them because of their value as individuals, and look at them not as a metaphor for some larger historical trends, but their real lives and what their dreams and hopes and ambitions were, because they were, just as real as you and me. And that's what I always try to convey when I'm writing about historical people.
That's great, because it's saying, these are not just pawns in this larger historical movement. They are the story themselves. And the great thing about it is that history, we so frequently kind of take that step back and it becomes so distant from us. But really, these are stories that are happening. We can find sometimes our own reflections in today. And you even said at the end of the presentation, you can see reflections and ripples into today. But if you tell it from that personal perspective and the stories of the people, then it makes it so much more meaningful. And that's what I loved about it.
Exactly. Thank you. And that was something that came up when I went to that family reunion. One of the folks at the reunion told me, I see personality traits in my relatives in members of the Townsend family. And, whether that's because it was passed down through the family or because some traits and ambitions and hopes are universal, he saw that individuality. And, there was another young woman who came up to me and said, you're not even related to us, but you think our family's incredible. And I was like, yeah, I do. And so that's what family history is often very meaningful to descendants, but I want it to be meaningful to all of us. And I think there are ways to do that.
And I think it can be a great way. I mean, we have a lot of people who come here who do genealogical research, and understanding where you come from and all the facets and the complexities of your family's history can just, like we were saying, make it more alive and make it more real. But can allow you also to confront different parts of family history and kind of come to terms with different things. It allows you, I think, to kind of see those broad historical concepts, but on this level, and kind of watch it be that person's story. And so that's what I loved in your presentation with how you were bringing in that personal side of it, as well as some things like the law that was coming in that they're having to live under and the circumstances that they were having to live under. I have a question, and I don't know how much of it you may know, how you were able to find out, because it's so hard to kind of trace this. But I know that you said that some of the mothers had died. And I saw on the one slip, I don't know if that was the same Susanna's mother, but had died. Do you have any evidence that any of them were able to reconnect with family who had not been emancipated?
Yes, that is a great question. And, there are studies and books specifically about the attempts of enslaved people to reconnect with families sold away from them under slavery. And that was the case with the Townsends. It's quite tragic. The way the will was structured is that a very specific number of enslaved people were freed, and they were freed because of their connections to the Townsends, either by blood or by marriage. So there were women who had children. There was a woman, Peggy, who had a child by Wesley Townsend, Samuel's son. So she was freed as a sexual partner of Wesley and as the mother of a Townsend grandson. But she had other children by enslaved people who were not freed. And so she had to make a choice. Do I go to freedom with my one child and leave my other children behind? And she had to make that decision. And so after the war, we see her and other women from the Townsend property who were in this situation seeking information about their families. And so they either wrote back to the lawyer directly asking for information, or Thomas Townsend, one of Samuel's sons, he was often used as an intermediary. So he would get information from all of the free Townsends. They trusted him because, you know, he's a family member. He's one of them. He's not this white lawyer. And he would then ask Cabanis because he had the best relationship with the lawyer out of all of the Townsends. The lawyers seemed to respect him almost as an equal insofar as Cabanis was capable of seeing any Black man as an equal. And so he would send letters asking, you know, Martha is asking about her daughter, Roxana, where is she? You know, Peggy is asking about her son, where is he? And there were cases where sometimes the children had died, and sometimes they were living in Alabama. They were free now and they had their own families. So, you know, there was still the separation between Alabama and Kansas or wherever the free Townsends were living. There was one especially interesting case that I never quite figured out. Edmund's two daughters, Lizzie and Jenny, they were the children of a woman named Lizzie Perryman. And Lizzie Perryman was the daughter of a white woman and a Black man in Virginia. So legally, she should have been freed because slavery follows the condition of the mother. She was the mixed race daughter of a free white woman. After her mother dies, her uncle illegally sells her into slavery, and she ends up being enslaved by Edmund Townsend and giving birth to his two daughters. And at a certain point, people from Virginia come down to Alabama and they say, we know who she is. We know this is illegal. We want to take her back. And Edmund says, no, it's okay. What if I promise to free her and give her and her children all my money when I die? Can I keep her then? And they essentially say yes. And Lizzie presumably believes him and stays with her daughters. And then when they leave, he sells her. He sells her just like her uncle sold her because she's an inconvenience. And so after the war, the daughters, Lizzie and Jenny, they seek out their mother and they find her, and their intention is to live with her after the war. But they find her in Tennessee. They stay with her for about 2 days, and then they leave and they never go back. They don't live with her anymore. I don't know if they ever communicate with her. And so I have no idea what happened at that meeting, why it didn't work out. But that's just, you know, one of the examples of these really difficult tragedies that come from the family separation under slavery.
Yeah, no, I mean, and then like you said, even just like you'll never know what happened in that meeting because it wasn't recorded. It wasn't something that they would probably talked about even afterwards. And there is a level of, you know, as historians trying to respect the fact that there is that privacy, but also so many questions about the communication. Like you said, if only there had been like, you know, 1,000 more letters to each other where you could understand more their perspective on things versus how they're acting to the lawyer. But what I will say is that you were able to piece together an amazing story of just kind of like personal perseverance and a family kind of working together, even from a perspective coming from the lawyer, you know, is that it's still the story comes through from that. And thank you so much for joining us on this day in particular to be able to talk to us about that, because so much of what you said, especially there at the end, are things for us to remember into today and how history and the present can talk to each other a lot. So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
And thank you to everyone who is joining us. And thank you for joining us virtually here this time and having patience with that. And we are excited to have you back in person again next month on July 17th. So thank you for joining, and thank you again.